Hey there. Tonight's story isn't about epic battles or fearless heroes. It's about a king who built the perfect army, shiny armor, perfect drills, flawless parades. But when war came, they ran. No fight. No glory. Just one very confused king, and a lot of empty boots. So if royal disasters and quiet chaos help you drift off, you're in the right place. Get comfortable. Let the noise fade. And follow me into the tale of the army that looked perfect, until it mattered. Close your eyes. And listen. The morning sun had only begun to warm the gilded edges of the Forbidden City when the Hall of Supreme Harmony filled with men who had no idea they were about to be dismissed from history. They knelt, row upon row, heads bowed low, foreheads nearly brushing the cold stone. Silk rustled like whispers of trees in a windless forest, and incense curled up toward the painted rafters, where dragons twined in mute judgment. Beneath them, silence reigned. At the center of this hush sat a girl who was not supposed to rule. She had no divine lineage, no blood ties to past emperors that were spoken aloud. But she had watched. She had listened. And now, draped in sea-green silk and seated upon a throne carved with phoenixes and lined with lapis, she barely blinked. The Empress was young, too young, according to the whisperers, but her silence had weight. Her stillness had gravity. She had been seated there for nearly an hour without speaking, and no one dared shift on their knees. The silence pressed against their spines like stone. Outside, the city pulsed with life, hawkers selling sesame cakes, street dogs barking over scraps, bamboo poles tapping in rhythm as they carried buckets of river water. But inside this chamber, time had stopped. Finally, she spoke. "Bring me the reports." The words were barely louder than breath, yet they seemed to echo like a bell struck deep in a cave. A eunuch stepped forward, his hands trembling beneath a tower of scrolls bound with silken ribbons. He bowed so low his forehead touched the ground. She did not nod. She did not look at him. One by one, she began to unroll the scrolls. "This one's margins are uneven," she murmured, the tone unreadable. The scribe responsible paled. Another scroll received her frown for its calligraphy. "It looks like a rat drowning," she said flatly. The offender did not defend himself. He only swallowed, audibly. A military dispatch was deemed too poetic. A tax report too vague. One budget proposal included the word perhaps. She paused. "Perhaps," she repeated, blinking slowly. "Does the Treasury now dream?" Nobody dared laugh. Or breathe. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the hall. "Do you all dream?" No one answered. "Then wake up." The word struck harder than a shouted command. The stillness deepened. Even the statues along the walls seemed to brace themselves. Another scroll was opened. "This one smells like pickled radish." The room gasped. The man who had delivered that report nearly fainted. She did not look at him. She only flicked the scroll to the floor like it had soiled her hand. "Rewrite it. But first, wash. You smell like cowardice." A second official twitched. She pointed at him. "You too." A ripple of panic moved through the crowd. The prime scribe dropped his brush. The Empress's eyes locked onto the motion. "Do you think I do this for amusement?" she asked no one in particular. She answered herself. No. Your incompetence does. At last, after hours of cutting silences and quiet condemnations, she rose. Her robes shimmered in the low morning light, seafoam silk with dragons embroidered in gold thread that caught the fire of sunrise. Scrolls crunched under her feet as she stepped down from the throne platform. "You are all dismissed," she said. Silence. Then, slowly, as if stunned by the absurdity of her words, heads lifted. "Leave your seals. Take your brushes. And your pride. I will govern alone." An inkstone clattered to the floor. One voice dared to rise, Minister Dow, once the tutor to her uncle, now trembling on fragile knees. "Your Majesty, the civil service, without it, the empire becomes interesting," she interrupted. He blinked. "You speak of tradition. Like foot binding. Like concubines." "Perhaps," she said, her lips curling into something between a smile and a snarl, "it's time tradition served me, not the other way around." Then, after a pause so long it threatened to break time itself, she said, "I will read the omens. I will write the laws. I will sign the death warrants. Alone." No one moved. Then slowly, heads lowered again. One by one, some wept. Others sat frozen. A few, just a few, looked at her with something new in their eyes. Not fear. Not awe. Recognition. And the Empress walked, slow and certain, through the hall of supreme harmony. Her footsteps echoed like judgment. Behind her, nothing moved but the banners. That day, the empire lost its voice. And gained something far more dangerous. The Grand Secretariat had once been the pulse of an empire, a living manuscript written in footsteps, whispered policy, and the rustle of silk against jade tiles. It was said that every breath taken beneath its vaulted ceiling shifted history, however slightly. But today, the chamber was still. Not reverent stillness, nor the hush of disciplined bureaucracy. This was the silence of dread. The summons had arrived not by tradition, not in cream parchment sealed with golden wax, but in red. Blood red. The kind of paper usually reserved for omens. Or executions. Inside the hall, dozens of ministers knelt, men with titles so long they ran out of room on their name plaques. Their foreheads pressed to the polished floor, their minds racing faster than any courier. They had been called before, but never like this. The seal had been hers alone. A single black phoenix in flight, wings torn, eyes unblinking. High above them, the throne sat like an altar. No fluted fans. No embroidered canopy. Just lacquered sandalwood carved with coiled dragons and phoenix feathers, dark as storm clouds. Atop it, Empress Wu. Her spine was straight. Her gaze unreadable. No smile, no scorn. Only a stillness so potent it seemed to compress the air around her. Behind her stood two eunuchs, each clutching scrolls thicker than any neck in the room. Their knuckles were white. These were not ceremonial decrees. These were lists. And lists, everyone knew, were dangerous. No one knew how long she had been awake. Some said she hadn't slept in days. Others said she dreamed with her eyes open and dictated to spirits. All knew that boredom was no longer a harmless indulgence in her court. She stood. A collective shiver rippled through the room like water touched by wind. Her robe was midnight blue, not the imperial gold of ceremony, nor the crimson of war. It was embroidered only with a single golden crane. A bird of long memory and longer judgment. "You have failed me." The words didn't ring. They fell. Each syllable was soft, measured. But together, they crushed. "I have listened to your verses," she said. "Your declarations. Your dedications to order, tradition, harmony." She stepped forward. Boots on polished stone. Thunder in disguise. "You confuse tradition with wisdom. Compliance with honor. Silence with virtue." Her shadow crossed the finance minister. He flinched. Not from guilt, not openly, but from the weight of being seen. "You recite the words of sages while your ink hides deceit. You worship your ancestors, yet you poison their legacy." A eunuch stepped forward with a scroll nearly half his height. She didn't glance at it. Only lifted her hand. It was cast into the fire basin that had been burning since dawn. The paper curled. Ink bled. Names vanished. She didn't blink. "I have read your reports. I have studied your ledgers. And I find no poetry in your excuses." Another scroll into the fire. Then another. One minister inhaled too sharply and began to cough. Another fainted, his hat rolling like a broken will across the jade floor. "Today, I dissolve this government." The words didn't echo. They embedded. "You will return to your provinces. To your gardens. To your temples. Reflect. Pray. Perhaps, in 3 months, I will listen again. If your names remain clean." The eunuch stepped aside. A dozen guards entered. Not swords drawn. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was blade enough. Some officials tried to rise with grace. Others stumbled, robes caught under their knees. A few simply stayed bowed, unwilling to move until touched. No one resisted. They were not being exiled. Not officially. But each man knew, when a woman like Wu told you to leave, it was the beginning of a ghost story, not a retirement. One by one, they exited through the grand doors. Some looked back. Most did not. The Empress sat again. Still expressionless. Only when the room was empty did she speak, this time to no one in particular. "Let us begin again." And from the screens behind the throne, they emerged. Not the ministers of old. The unwritten court. They had no robes of rank. No seals of office. No ancestral lines traced on silk. Just ink-stained fingers, sharp eyes, and minds that did not ask permission before speaking truth. Former concubines. Disgraced scribes. A girl from the river provinces who had once written a treatise on irrigation in secret and mailed it to the palace, unsure it would even be read. They bowed, some awkwardly, some defiantly. And she did not dismiss them. Outside, the streets of Luoyang continued to buzz. Vendors shouted. Drums beat. The scent of frying scallion cakes danced through alleys. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the empire had just been turned inside out. And no one even screamed. At first, the capital did not understand. The dismissal of the entire Grand Secretariat was so audacious, so absurd, that even the most cynical courtiers believed it had to be temporary. A gesture. A storm of fury that would pass once the Empress had calmed, once she had found reason, once she had remembered that even emperors cannot govern alone. But days passed. And the old men did not return. Their carriages sat idle behind locked gates. Their estate lanterns, once lit in signal of ongoing influence, remained dark. At the Ministry of Rights, the windows were shuttered. At the Ministry of War, an office boy fed crows with leftover rice, awaiting orders that never came. Yet the empire did not collapse. Grain moved. Taxes were collected. Letters still arrived from the provinces. Officials at the borders continued stamping papers. Nothing crumbled. And that terrified more than any revolution. Because what, then, had all those generations of hierarchy been for? What, then, had all the kneeling, bowing, memorizing, sacrificing, and flattering accomplished, if the empire could continue without the ones who insisted they were its bones? And then, slowly, others arrived. They did not come with fanfare. They did not wear robes of rank, nor announce themselves with gongs or drums. They entered the court like rainwater slipping through cracked tiles, subtle, persistent, undeniable. A woman from the outer provinces, her hands stained with ink and mulberry pulp, who once transcribed poems for a disbanded literary guild, was seen walking alongside the Empress near the Lotus Pavilion. Days later, the format of imperial edicts changed, shorter, clearer, with none of the florid metaphor the ministers once adored. A former concubine, known only as May, reappeared wearing plain scholar's robes. Rumors whispered she had submitted a treatise on grain transportation under a false name. It had included diagrams made from ash and rice paste. She was now overseeing the canal schedules. A boy, barely 16, with oil-stained sleeves and a slight stammer had once been caught sneaking into the palace archives. Instead of punishment, he was summoned. He now sat on a low bench outside the Empress's study, recalibrating the seasonal calendar with equations scribbled on torn scrolls. They were not called officials. They had no titles, no seals, no ancestral halls to which their names could be added. They were simply there. And yet, they were heard. Inside the palace walls, a new rhythm took hold. Gone were the daily rituals of praise and performance. The mornings no longer began with hollow recitations or offerings of incense to long-dead emperors. Instead, they began with arguments. With laughter. With passionate debates about prison reform, irrigation, astronomy, and education. Scrolls were passed not to be read aloud, but challenged. The Empress demanded not loyalty, but persuasion. "Convince me," she would say, reclining slightly with her chin resting on her hand. "And don't bore me." And they did. With maps drawn hastily on the backs of old temple rosters, with metaphors borrowed from storms and shadows, with trembling voices that grew steadier with each meeting. They became known, half-mockingly at first, as the Ghost Court. Always present, yet never introduced. Their names passed in whispers, not in proclamations. Their authority came not from heritage, but from intellect. Not from tradition, but from daring. The guards referred to them with confusion and admiration. "They never sleep," said one. "They argue with her," said another. "They win." This unnerved the old nobility more than any rebellion could have. These weren't generals. These weren't sons of lords. These were women, street scholars, exiled thinkers. People who should have remained invisible. People who had been punished for asking questions, now answering them for the empire. One afternoon, the empress held court not in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, but in the garden pavilion. No thrones. No carpets. Just floor cushions and pots of tea. She invited 3 advisors from the ghost court to debate a proposed land tax adjustment. Each took a turn. One presented economic charts sketched on silk scraps. Another recited a poem that illustrated the burden on farmers. The third simply stood and said, "We can't afford not to." Wu listened. Asked 3 questions. And then stood. "Let it be done," she said. And it was. Outside the palace, the whispers grew louder. "She rules with scribes, not swords," muttered one disgraced minister in a tea shop. "She'll destroy the empire," said another. But no one could deny what was happening. For the first time in memory, governance did not feel distant. It felt malleable. A merchant from the southern provinces sent a suggestion about silk tariffs, written in humble brushstroke. It was returned 2 weeks later, approved, with 3 words scrawled in the empress's hand. A rare clarity. A peasant girl's riddle about justice appeared in a footnote in a court decree. A local schoolteacher's proposal for a traveling library was approved with royal funding. This was not bureaucracy. This was invention. And Wu? She let it grow. She surrounded herself not with statues, but sparks, minds willing to argue, to rethink, to risk being wrong. The court no longer echoed with silence and ceremony. It thrummed with possibility. The empire had not been emptied. It had been rewritten. Not everyone bowed to the rising rhythm. Beyond the crimson gates of the palace, in lacquered mansions where the old ministers once whispered couplets over sweet plum wine, silence hung like a shroud. These were the homes of the dismissed, scholars, bureaucrats, men who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing irreplaceable. Now, they sat idle, their seals surrendered, their words no longer requested. But they were not idle in mind. In one such house, a villa with a jade-tiled roof and courtyards perfumed by wilted orchids, 3 of them gathered by candlelight. They did not sit like traitors. They sat like mourners. Mourners for a world unraveling. "She governs with gardeners and dreamers," spat Grand Minister Shen, his voice graveled with wine and wounded pride. "She has replaced trained minds with metaphors." Across from him, Chancellor Wei stirred his tea, watching the leaves dance. "It is performance," he murmured. "A theater of novelty. Let the people clap. But when the river floods, when the fields fail, who will they blame?" Shen's fist landed softly on the table. "They'll blame us," he whispered. "Even now, we are made into villains." But it was not hatred that drove them. It was fear. Not fear of the Empress's wrath, but fear of becoming irrelevant. For centuries, power had belonged to a certain kind of man, robed in citation, shielded by precedent, fluent in ritual. Now, that man was being outpaced by scribes without surnames and concubines who spoke in policy. And it wasn't just in the capital. In a quiet mountain province, a governor refused to enact a new land reform decree. "I will not obey an edict written by a peasant girl," he declared, and burned the scroll. In a coastal monastery, the monks refused to chant for the empress. "She has severed the root of order," the abbot said. "We pray for a return to the way." Even among the generals, rumors stirred. "She speaks to no one," one muttered. "She signs everything herself," said another. "She listens too closely, then strikes too precisely." The empress, of course, knew. She always knew. Reports came daily, not through generals or governors, but through shadows. She had eyes in tea shops, ears in brothels, tongues behind folding screens. She did not panic. She prepared. In a small courtyard tucked behind her private study, construction began on what appeared to be a garden pavilion. Elegant, octagonal, its eaves curved like question marks, its beams etched with clouds. But inside, there were no lanterns. No incense burners. Only shelves. Hundreds of them. Stacked with scrolls. Not legal decrees. Not tax records. These were voices. Scrolls sent by farmers describing broken roads. Letters from soldiers about boot shortages. Poems by students. Philosophical musings from drunk philosophers. Even a child's drawing of a bridge made from bamboo and moonlight. Wu called it her registry of the unheard. Her memory palace. Not of lineage, but of possibility. She read them late into the night, her fingers inked black, her lamp flickering. "Let the empire whisper," she once told her attendants. "I will gather its breath." And this terrified her enemies more than any army. Because what if the people believed their whispers mattered? What if a shepherd boy's idea could reach the throne? What then, of the robes? The rituals? The men who had ruled because their fathers had ruled before them? So the opposition changed its weapon. From policy to rumor. They did not attack her reforms. They attacked her character. "She speaks with ghosts," said one flyer, posted on a temple door. "She poisons her courtiers to test their loyalty," whispered another. "She is not a woman," said a third. "She is an omen." Wu laughed when she read them. "Let them speak," she said. "Let them fear." But behind her amusement was calculation. Because she knew what stories could do. So, she summoned the poets. One evening, under flickering lanterns, she transformed the Hall of Enlightened Harmony into a stage. The ministers were invited, or rather, summoned, but found no ledgers, no reports. Only verses. Recitations. Satire. Poems mocking corrupt officials. Skits lampooning tradition. Epigrams that exposed greed with rhymes that cut deeper than blades. At first, the aristocrats scoffed. But the people listened. And laughter spread like wildfire. In the markets, vendors began quoting lines from the court plays. In taverns, children recited punchlines with perfect cadence. The empire had found a new voice. And Wu? She sharpened it. She appointed a new post, the archivist of absurdities. Their duty, to collect every rumor, every insult, every accusation whispered in the dark. Each week, one would be selected. Not to be suppressed, but to be performed. "If they say I dance with demons," she once quipped, "then let the demons wear court robes and argue tax reform." And so they did. The plays became legend. A eunuch playing a deposed minister who couldn't stop crying when offered bribes. A young woman pretending to be a Confucian scholar who recited ancient proverbs while setting fire to rice. The audience howled. And the Empress? She watched, smiling, her eyes catching every flicker of discomfort among the old guard. This was not mockery. It was strategy. She disarmed her enemies with laughter. She rewrote power with performance. But most importantly, she invited the people to laugh with her, not at her. The court had become a theater. The empire, an audience. And Wu? She was the playwright. And the joke was never on her. Deep within the palace, past layers of courtyard scented with osmanthus and the silent glide of white-robed attendants, there stood a chamber known only to a few. It had no formal name on the palace registry. On some maps, it was simply left blank. The Empress called it the Mirror Hall. It was not a hall in the architectural sense. It had no throne, no banners, no ceremonial path. Just walls paneled with polished bronze, their surfaces dulled from centuries of staring back at secrets. And in the middle of that room, Wu often stood alone. No entourage. No scribes. No guards. Just her reflection, multiplied endlessly. By daylight, the room shimmered like the inside of a coin. At night, under a single hanging lantern, it felt like being trapped inside someone else's dream. She came here when the noise of power grew too loud. When every word outside was a trap or a test, when even the wind through the palace windows carried suspicion, she returned here to look at herself. To remember what face she wore, and what faces she had shed. Because Wu had not always been Empress. She had not even always been Wu. She remembered the first time she stepped through the palace gates as a teenager, offered as a concubine to a dying emperor. Her name was barely spoken aloud. Her opinions were not sought. Her presence was ornamental. And yet, she had listened. Watched. Memorized the rooms others merely walked through. She remembered tea ceremonies where women fought with smiles. Banquets where one misplaced gaze could end a life. Scrolls hidden beneath floorboards. Secrets traded for silks. She had once cried in this very hall, years ago, when she realized no one would come looking for her if she disappeared. Now, she stood beneath the same lantern, the tears long dried. She was no longer a girl. She was the state. But even the state, sometimes, must confess. One evening, long after midnight, she entered the mirror hall in silence and found a figure already there. It was May, the former concubine, now her quietest and most brilliant advisor. May knelt before a mirror, her shoulders trembling. Wu paused. "Do the reflections speak back to you, too?" she asked softly. May turned, startled. Her cheeks were wet. "I didn't know anyone else came here," she whispered. Wu stepped closer. "Neither did I." They stood in silence for a while, reflections spinning out around them like echoes trapped in glass. May finally spoke. "I thought. I was ready. For power. For being heard. But some days, it feels like I am just pretending louder than the men did. Wu did not answer immediately. Then she raised a hand and placed it flat against one of the mirrors. The reflection did the same, her face lit by the lantern above, weary, sharp, human. That's the secret, she said. They weren't certain, either. They were just allowed to hide it. May's eyes widened. Even you. Wu looked at her. Especially me. It was not an admission of weakness. It was a revelation of strength. Because certainty, she had learned, was not a condition of leadership. It was a performance. And she had mastered that theater. They stayed there until the lantern burned low, two women wrapped in silence and bronze. Not ruler and subject, not master and aide, just two minds, trying to carry the weight of a world too slow to change and too proud to admit they were changing it. Outside the mirror hall, the world spun on. The ghost court continued its work, rewriting property laws, translating ancient texts into common speech, dismantling bribe-for-rank systems that had stood for centuries. Some reforms were met with applause, others with riots. One former magistrate tried to publish a scathing critique of the new policies. The presses seized his manuscript. It had already been reprinted, not as policy, but as satire, with footnotes correcting his grammar. Another governor, refusing to distribute grain under Wu's famine directive, was publicly stripped of his office. His replacement? A woman who had never held public rank, but had fed 4 villages from her own stores during the drought. She wept when appointed. And the plays continued. New ones every week. Some comedic, some tragic. All sharpened by truth. One depicted a man so obsessed with tradition he forgot to eat, and died mid-recital, still quoting the analects. Another showed an empress haunted by her past lives, all of them men who had ruled poorly. The people laughed. The ministers fumed. And Wu? She watched, quietly, from behind the lattice screens. Not for amusement. For calibration. Because power, she knew, was not a sword you held. It was a mirror you polished, until others saw themselves in it. And when they did, truly saw themselves, they would stop fearing the future. They would start writing it. It began not with war, but with water. In the southern province of Yong, the river had always behaved. It curved obediently through the valley, feeding rice fields, reflecting temple lanterns, ferrying prayers down its gentle length. But then came the rains. Heavy, defiant, endless, like the heavens had grown weary of restraint. The river rose, spilled, tore through dikes and walls, turned farms into swamps and villages into ghosts. It was disaster, yes. But it was also opportunity. The regional governor, a man named Han Yi, had long bristled under the empress's reforms. He wore tradition like armor and treated every decree from Luoyang as a personal insult. When the flood came, he did not request aid. He declared autonomy. He framed it not as rebellion, but as restoration. The re-establishment of order by rightful stewards of heaven's balance. Wu received the message on the 3rd morning after the breach. She read it once, then again. It was beautifully written. Full of ancient metaphors, appeals to cosmic harmony, invocations of ancestors. She folded the scroll. He's daring me to respond with fire, she said aloud. In the chamber, her council remained silent. But one, the boy from the clockmaker's district, now called Seema, stepped forward. He's hoping for fire, he said. So the old world can burn and call it martyrdom. Wu nodded. Yes, she said. But we won't give him fire. She gave him mirrors instead. Within days, her messengers scattered. Not soldiers. Not emissaries. Historians. Poets. Midwives. Fishermen. They carried scrolls, not swords. And everywhere they went, they asked questions. Not about Han Yi. About the flood. What was lost? Who had helped? Who had hoarded grain? Which temples opened their doors? Which landlords closed their gates? They collected names. Stories. Silences. And Wu read every one. Then she wrote back. Not with an army. With paper. A single edict, distributed throughout Yong province and beyond, printed in bold ink and plain language. The Empress recognizes the valor of the people of Yong. She mourns your loss. She honors your endurance. And she will not let your stories drown. With it came relief wagons, rerouted from the capital, escorted not by generals, but by village women who had organized flood relief after the last monsoon. They arrived singing. Carrying not banners of conquest, but quilts, food, tools. And with them, Wu sent a play. The Mountain That Refused to Drown. It told of a province struck by flood, ruled by a governor obsessed with preserving his legacy. As the water rose, he ordered the scribes to write praises of his strength instead of plans to save the people. He floated away on scrolls while his people climbed roofs and prayed for the moon to listen. The play was performed in town squares. Laughter rippled through the crowds. Han Yi, miles away in his carved estate, heard the echoes of it. He banned the performance. It was staged outside his gate. He arrested a troop. Another replaced it. No soldiers marched. No armies rallied. But his authority unraveled all the same. And then the letters began. Not from rebels. From his own officials. Each one cited lines from the play. Each one resigned. Within a month, the people of Yong began referring to their new administrators, appointed quietly by Wu's court, as the river hands. They coordinated aid. Restored roads. Built floating bridges using plans drawn by an apprentice architect from the ghost court. Han Yi vanished. Some said he fled to the mountains. Others claimed he entered a monastery under another name. Wu never sought him. She had already won. And not just in Yong. The empire watched what had happened. And for the first time, they did not see a woman struggling to hold power. They saw a sovereign rewriting the very grammar of it. She did not conquer dissent. She drowned it in truth. In Luoyang, the courtiers murmured about the flood that spoke louder than swords. And in the tea houses, storytellers began with a new phrase. Back when the Empress silenced a governor without lifting her voice. Inside the palace, Wu met with her ghost court beneath lanterns shaped like cranes. They spread maps, not of land, but of silence, tracking where voices had yet to rise. There, said Mei, pointing. A province with no letters in months. And here, added Seema. A school where girls are not allowed to write their names. Wu leaned over the scroll. These are not empty places, she said. Only unheard. And so, she set her next campaign. Not for territory. For testimony. It began with a petition. A simple sheet of paper, delivered by an elderly monk with ink-stained fingers. He bowed low, his back a question mark, and left the scroll at the base of the palace steps. It bore over 30,000 signatures. At first glance, it appeared harmless, a call for the empress to restore the ancient naming rights. But beneath the respectful language, the purpose was clear. Strip Wu Zetian of her imperial name. Return her title to one befitting a regent, a widow, a caretaker, anything but ruler in her own right. The old elite had grown clever. They knew swords could be broken, rebellions crushed. But a name? A name could be changed quietly. Legally. Permanently. It would not bleed her. It would erase her. Wu received the scroll in silence. She was seated beneath a blossoming cherry tree, the scent sweet, the petals scattering like faded dreams. She read every name. Some she recognized. Former scholars. Dismissed officials. A handful of generals too old to fight, but not too old to conspire. She said nothing for a long while. Then, to her aide's surprise, she smiled. 30,000, she mused. Good. That means they still think names matter. That evening, she summoned the ghost court. Not for strategy. For stories. They gathered in the mirror hall, the room lit by moonlight alone. No scrolls. No arguments. Just memories. I want to know what they called you, Wu said, before they let you speak. And so they told her. Mei was once the Whisperer, a name given to concubines too clever to be trusted. Seema had no name outside his district, the clockmaker's son, always that boy. One woman had been second daughter, even into her 30s. Another had been called the tall one, as though height had been her only distinction. Wu listened. And when they were done, she whispered. Let them come for my name. I have worn others, and I remember them all. The next morning, she issued an invitation. Not a decree. An invitation. To every province, every village, every monastery, and market, she asked the people to send her their discarded names. Not their official ones. The ones given in cruelty. In mockery. In erasure. She promised to read them all. She called it, the Registry of Broken Names. At first, it seemed a symbolic gesture. A gesture of empathy. But then the scrolls arrived. Thousands of them. Name after name. Mouse boy. Unmarriageable. Cracked pot. No voice. Mistake. One eye. Third wife's burden. Names that weren't names. They were scars. Wu read them in the evenings. Alone, often in tears. And then she responded. To each. A single sentence for every name, written in her own hand. You are seen. You are not your silence. I name you worthy. The letters were returned. And with them, began the war. Not of blades, of words. Monasteries protested. Scholars raged. She is unmaking order, they declared. She is rewriting the divine structure. They composed essays, burned incense, chanted under moonless skies. But the people, oh, the people, began renaming themselves. Quietly at first. A former servant girl started signing her correspondence not as orphan, but Lanhua, orchid. A potter changed the seal on his clay from bent nail to Jin, true. A boy who had never been called anything but useless submitted a poem signed Morning River. Wu collected these, too. She began commissioning art, tapestries, scrolls, carvings, with these new names woven into the design. And one night, in the heart of the capital, she unveiled her answer to the petition. A monument. A vast stone stele carved with 3 columns of characters. On the left, her old names. Concubine. Widow. Witch. Interloper. Usurper. In the middle, the names of every woman in the ghost court, their old epithets, struck through. Their chosen names beside them, engraved in gold. On the right, blank space. And beneath it, the words. This space is for you. Crowds gathered for days. They came to stare. To cry. To add their names in chalk and charcoal, knowing rain would take them, but that someone had left them space to exist. The petition, meanwhile, was quietly withdrawn. No announcement. No apology. Just absence. Wu never spoke of it again. She had not needed to. Instead, she turned her attention to language itself. The edicts began to change. Where once they had been thick with Confucian metaphor, now they were stark, elegant, and human. Laws were rewritten to remove class-based euphemisms. Court poetry began to include voices from commoners, from the disabled, from the anonymous. And in schools, children were taught not only how to write their names, but how to choose them. Names not as inheritance. Names as declaration. In a court of lanterns and laughter, where poems ruled as fiercely as proclamations, not all work happened in the light. There were still messages too delicate for parchment. Questions too dangerous for daylight. And so, Wu created a post never formally acknowledged, never carved into jade or woven into banners. She called it the Minister of Shadows. His name was Chen Rui. A man with no official rank, no lineage of scholars or generals, no portrait hanging in ancestral halls. He had once been a street performer, a shadow puppeteer known for silent shows that left audiences breathless. Wu first saw him during a festival. A tale told in flickering silhouettes, an old judge tricked by his own reflection, a servant girl who swapped masks until she became queen. She watched from the back, veiled and still. At the end of the performance, she had whispered to her aide, "Bring him to me." Anyone who can tell that truth without words can speak for those who cannot. Now, Chen Rui reported directly to her. Not with documents. With stories. Each evening, he arrived in her chambers and unrolled a screen of silk. Upon it, he placed cutouts, paper-thin figures, some barely larger than a coin. And with oil lamp and rod, he began. A farmer in the northern plains silenced for building an unauthorized well. A teacher jailed for reading banned poetry aloud to girls. A mother whose missing son's name was erased from the census. He told their tales in shadows, letting their pain dance in silhouette. Wu never interrupted. She watched. And when the last shadow faded, she would whisper one word. Seen. Then came her reply, not to the messenger, but to the empire. A new decree. A sudden inspection of a governor's prison. A quiet release of funds for a widow's inn. Sometimes, a poem published anonymously in the Palace Gazette, with a final line quoting the unseen. These were not policies. They were surgical truths. And the people began to notice. A child's drawing of a shadow puppet appeared on a market stall in Luoyang. A merchant named his boat Ink and Light. A soldier tattooed a single phrase onto his wrist. She listens in the dark. It became a proverb. To be heard by the empress, whisper into shadow. But not all were pleased. The old guard, those who still dreamed of thrones gilded with lineage, called it espionage cloaked in art. They accused her of turning the court into a stage, the ministers into actors. She rules with stories, one noble spat. Another, more bitter, she has replaced laws with theater. Wu's answer was silence. And a new performance. This time, not in the court, but on a barge. One moonless night, on the river that curved through the capital, a floating stage was built. Simple. Bare. Seats for only a few dozen. She invited only commoners, widows, bakers, stonemasons, letter writers. No officials. No generals. No scribes. Just those who had written her, those who had whispered from the margins. The play? A shadow tale. No names. Just a silhouette of a woman. She rose from concubinage, was buried beneath shame, climbed out with a pen, rewrote the laws, redefined the throne. At the end, she stood alone, surrounded by ghosts. Not enemies. Echoes. And she bowed. The crowd wept. When the barge returned to shore, they found a single banner hanging above the gangplank. The empire belongs to the living. The next day, a petition arrived on Wu's desk. Not from nobility. From children. Dozens of small scrolls, tied with string, each bearing a crude drawing of a woman in robes. Some showed her laughing. Others riding a tiger. One showed her standing atop the moon. No words. Just signatures. Or rather, names newly chosen. Wu held them for a long time. Later that night, she summoned Chen Rui once more. Make a new tale, she said softly. Not for the shadows. For the sun. He bowed, and for the first time, placed the empress herself among his figures. Not as sovereign. As student. A woman still learning how to carry the voices she'd gathered. Far to the west of Luoyang, beyond the last toll gates and the terraced hills lined with barley, stood a monastery carved into the side of a mountain. It had no name. Locals called it the listening stone, for it was said the wind there never howled, only murmured. The monks who lived there followed no emperor. They bowed to no seal. They were scholars of silence. Keepers of scrolls so old that even the spiders walked cautiously across them. And they had one sacred rule: they did not speak of the outside world. But even silence has its limits. One spring morning, a courier arrived, not with a scroll, but with a puppet. Made of rice paper and lacquered bamboo. The courier said nothing. He placed it on the stone steps, bowed, and left. The puppet was a woman. She wore no crown. She held no sword. But her eyes had been cut with such care, such precision, that they seemed to watch even the wind. The monks debated what to do. To acknowledge the gift would be to break centuries of isolation. To ignore it would be to ignore the possibility that silence was no longer sacred, only safe. They chose to listen. And in doing so, they did what they had not done in 100 years. They sent a letter. A single line. We heard her shadow. It arrived weeks later, folded into a lotus, carried by a boy who had memorized every step of the mountain path. Wu read it in silence. She pressed her fingers to the paper and closed her eyes. There were some victories that needed no proclamation. Instead of replying, she commissioned a copy of the imperial archives to be made, not the official records, but the ghost court's internal histories. The anonymous drafts, the marginalia, the whispered reforms that had never been spoken aloud. And she sent them, not by courier, but by cart. Sealed in bamboo crates. Pulled by oxen. Guarded not by soldiers, but by children who had once sent her broken names. The monks accepted the gift. And did what they did best. They began to transcribe. And as they did, something strange began to happen. Scholars began appearing in nearby villages, asking about the court's lesser-known edicts. Farmers began quoting obscure legal lines in town disputes. Young women, who had never seen a classroom, began drafting petitions with terrifying clarity. The empire was breathing through new lungs. One evening, Wu sat beneath the great paper map in her study, the one covered not in borders, but in brushstrokes of voices. A tapestry of echoes. She traced a line from Luoyang to the mountain. Then, she dipped her brush and wrote one word beside it. Heard. Her ministers were confused. No revolt had been crushed. No territory gained. Why mark this? She only smiled. Because they listened. But the mountain was only one ripple. Elsewhere, the sea was beginning to rise. In the eastern provinces, a merchant woman began offering interest-free loans using Wu's land reform as collateral. She called it the people's credit. In the northern steppes, a nomad scribe, once enslaved by a governor, published a new calendar that included lunar festivals from forgotten tribes. He dedicated it to the era where the unheard were written in. In the capital, a blind girl performed a play without sight, only sound. The audience sat in darkness. Every word was felt, not seen. Wu attended in secret. She wept openly. This, she whispered, is the future. And yet, shadows lengthened. Because not all silence is ignorance. Some silence waits. Beyond the border walls, across rivers and sand, a foreign king heard of the empress who ruled with theater and mirrors. He laughed, until he saw the gold flowing from Luoyang's new trade. In a rival court, whispers turned to envy. How could a woman, a former concubine, command such loyalty without swords? There would be questions. Then there would be challenges. But for now, Wu sat beneath lantern light, holding a letter from a mountain. A letter that said, "We heard you." And that, she knew, was more powerful than any title carved in jade. It meant the world no longer feared its own reflection. It meant the mirror had cracked, and through the break, light had entered. By late autumn, the court had changed its shape. What had once been a hall of droning voices and embroidered silks had become a place of unpredictable silence, punctuated by sudden laughter, heated argument, or the rustle of scrolls written by hands not trained in calligraphy, but in living. But Wu missed something. Or rather, someone. The chairs. The long lacquered row of ministerial seats that once stood to either side of the throne had not been removed. They remained, polished, perfectly spaced, waiting. Unoccupied. Each one represented a rank, a bloodline, a voice that had once spoken with certainty. Now they sat empty, witnesses to a new kind of power that had no need for upholstery. But Wu, in her precise way, did not like loose ends. One morning, as red leaves blew through the colonnades and mist curled around the stone lions, she ordered a banquet. Not for the ghost court. Not for the provinces. Not for allies. For the empty chairs. The announcement spread quickly. Invitations were carved into slabs of bamboo and nailed to market poles. Artists painted scrolls with golden script, "The Empress dines with absence." At sunset, the court filled, not with dignitaries, but with commoners, curious travelers, couriers, errant monks, rice farmers still streaked with mud. They entered not through the main gate, but the servants' side, by design. Inside, the dining hall gleamed. Every chair had a place setting. Gold plates. Porcelain bowls. Chopsticks carved with the names of long-gone ministers. And on each plate, a single item, a sealed letter. Wu entered last. She wore no crown. Her robe was unadorned, dyed the color of old ink. She took no seat. She walked the hall slowly, fingers grazing each backrest, pausing now and then to smile at someone in the crowd. Then, she spoke. "Tonight," she said, "we honor those who are no longer needed, not out of scorn, but clarity." She gestured to the chairs. These men ruled by repetition. They feared silence, because silence invites thought. They feared questions, because questions break rhythm. And they feared you. A hush fell. She moved to the first chair and opened the letter on the plate. She read aloud. "I was Minister of Rights. I once sentenced a girl to exile for composing a poem with the wrong seasonal metaphor. She died in a sandstorm. I never said her name again. Tonight, I remember her. Her name was Liang." She moved to the next. "I was Chancellor of Trade. I dismissed a boy who suggested we open our docks to ships from the southern coast. I told him we needed purity, not profit. He started a warehouse with a fishing net and a notebook. Now, his fleet feeds 3 provinces. His name was one. Chair after chair. Letter after letter. Confessions. Regrets. Reminders." The crowd listened in stillness. Some wept. Others stood with fists clenched, memories surfacing of mothers silenced, brothers exiled, daughters denied names. When she reached the final chair, Wu paused. It bore no name. No letter. Only a mirror. Polished until flawless. She lifted it and held it high. This, she said, is the only minister I still consult. Her voice did not rise, but the echo of it filled the room. Then she turned to the crowd and bowed. The Empress bowed. To farmers, to poets, to children, to the bent-backed old women who had walked for days to see her face. Then she left. No feast. No fanfare. The chairs remained, their letters untouched, their plates cold. But the next morning, they were gone. Each chair vanished, taken not by decree, but by the people. One was seen strapped to the back of a donkey headed toward the northern hills. Another was converted into a shrine base in a village where a tax collector once ruled with cruelty. One chair appeared in a school, where a girl sat in it every morning to write new laws with chalk. The throne itself remained. But now, it stood alone by design. And behind it, where once the portraits of ancestors had loomed, Wu ordered a new mural. An empty chair, surrounded by hands. Not grasping. Lifting. It arrived at dawn, tucked beneath a loaf of barley bread in a basket meant for the palace kitchens. The guards nearly missed it, a folded scrap of rice paper, smudged with flour, unmarked by any official stamp. But the calligraphy was too precise to ignore. Someone had written with a trembling kind of control, the kind that comes from hands used to silence, not ink. The note bore just 5 words. The wolf wears golden robes. Wu received it without ceremony. She read it once. Then again. Her eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in focus. She called no meeting. She summoned no guards. Instead, she asked for a map. Not of provinces. Not of battlefields. A map of faces. A parchment covered in miniature portraits of foreign envoys, tribute-bearers, wandering sages, and distant rulers. She placed her fingertip on one, a man from a western court who had, only weeks ago, gifted her a falcon carved from ivory and whispered praises of her wisdom. He had smiled too easily. Spoken in riddles. Left no offering for the ancestors. The wolf wears golden robes. A warning. But of what? That night, Wu stood in her garden, surrounded by candlelight and moon shadow, and listened to the wind move through the bamboo. She did not trust dreams, too slippery. But she trusted patterns. And something in the empire had begun to fray. Letters from the southern borders arrived later than usual. Trade ships carried fewer poems, more whispers. A courier vanished on the northern road. These were not coincidences. They were the rhythm of change. She summoned May. The archivist appeared in silence, robes trailing like a brushstroke on stone. Wu handed her the note. May read it. Did not flinch. Is it metaphor? She asked. Wu shook her head. It's a question, she replied. And we must answer it before the wolf learns to howl. The next day, she sent no reply. Instead, she sent mirrors. Small, hand-held, polished bronze, delivered to every regional governor, every border guard, every market inspector. Alongside each was a single sentence. Before you speak of enemies, look at yourself. The empire buzzed. Some called it madness. Others called it magic. But all understood, something was coming, and the Empress was not waiting with swords. She was waiting with reflection. Then came the performance. Of course. Wu took to the imperial stage, surrounded by dancers, masked actors, and a crowd filled not with nobility, but with traders, weavers, fishmongers, and street poets. The play was simple. A wolf disguised as a merchant entered the kingdom. He bowed low, gifted golden coins, and spoke of peace. But at night, he stole names from the sleeping, names that vanished from memory with the rising sun. By the third act, no one in the kingdom remembered who ruled them. Not even the wolf. The crowd sat in silence. And Wu, seated not on a throne but among them, whispered, "Beware those who praise you without remembering your name." Days passed. Then came another letter. This time in silk. No words. Just an embroidered pattern, a wolf with a crown, but no teeth. Wu studied it long into the night. The message was clear. "We see you. But we are not afraid." She did not respond. Instead, she wrote a poem. A quiet one. It was published anonymously in a border town gazette, tucked between weather reports and farming advice. When the wolf speaks honey, the hive listens with knives. Let the robe shimmer. Gold stains like blood. It spread without attribution. But everyone knew the voice. Meanwhile, she prepared. Not armies. Not weapons. She sent teachers to the border towns. Not to instruct in war, but in language. Dialects. Scripts. Proverbs from foreign lands. She built bridges of understanding while others built walls. And she waited. Not for invasion. For misunderstanding. For the moment when some distant power, dressed in silk and smiling too brightly, would misstep, thinking her soft because she sang. She would not need to raise a blade. She had taught her people how to see. And now, she was teaching them how to speak back. The wolf still watched. But so did the empire. And this time, they did not wait for orders. They watched with mirrors in hand. In the center of the capital stood the drum of declarations. A massive cylinder of lacquered oak and oxhide, struck once each morning to announce imperial edicts. Its sound rolled through streets and markets like a command from heaven. Merchants paused, scholars held their breath, and soldiers stiffened. It had never missed a day. Until now. On the first morning of the 10th moon, as the mist still clung to the rooftops and the tea stalls had only begun to boil water, the drum stood silent. No beat. No proclamation. Only stillness. At first, the people waited. They gathered by habit, bakers, boatmen, bead sellers, each glancing toward the tower. But nothing came. Not a whisper. Not a messenger. Only the rising sun and the faint rustle of leaves in the palace garden. By midday, rumors spread like spilled ink. Had the empress fallen ill? Was there a coup? Had the heavens withdrawn their voice? In the palace, Wu sat alone. No courtiers. No ghost court. No dancers or mapmakers or scribes. Before her lay a single object, a brush. And beside it, a blank scroll. She had written nothing that day. Not a law. Not a letter. Not a line of poetry. Instead, she listened. not to ministers or petitions. To absence. She let the silence stretch, longer than comfort allowed. She remembered the sound of her father's voice, once thick with regret for having no sons. She remembered the silence that followed when she asked, as a child, "Can a girl become emperor?" She remembered the quiet of her first night in the palace, the way the candle fluttered like a thing afraid to burn. And now, she had made the empire hear it too. By dusk, the city trembled with questions. A group of poets gathered near the base of the drum tower. They began composing verses in chalk across the stone steps. No beat today. Perhaps the empire dreams. A child tied a ribbon to the drum's base. Another child followed. Then another. Soon, it bloomed like a festival lantern. Somewhere in the southern quarter, an old woman stood on a crate and recited her life aloud, just in case the silence meant forgetting. In a tavern, a butcher recounted the names of every friend lost to plague, war, or poverty. The streets became a theater of memory. And Wu watched from the upper windows. She had always known that power was not in noise. It was in the space between. The next morning, the people returned, but this time, they brought offerings. Not of gold or scrolls or tribute, but of truth. A carpenter laid a broken chisel at the drum's feet, saying, "I made the same joints for 20 years before anyone told me they were flawed." A midwife offered the name of a girl child she had helped hide during a village census that counted only sons. A tax collector confessed that he had once added a false name to the ledger, a ghost child, to save a widow from losing her grain. Wu ordered each to be recorded. Not in the legal register. In a new book, the Chronicle of Silence. A living archive of things never said, never dared, never allowed. And still, she did not strike the drum. Not until the 7th day. That morning, she entered the drum tower alone. The guards stepped aside, unsure whether to kneel or flee. She wore a robe of deep indigo, embroidered with a single line of gold thread down the spine, like a fault line waiting to split. She climbed the stairs. And without ceremony, she raised the mallet. One strike. The sound tore across the sky like thunder waking a sleeping sea. Birds scattered. Dogs barked. Windows quivered in their frames. Then silence again. But it was different now. Not empty. Full. The people waited. And from the tower, her voice. For 6 days, I let silence speak. It remembered more than we ever declared. Let this drum ring only when we are ready to listen. She descended without fanfare. The next edict was brief. A single line, printed on pale silk and hung in every school, bathhouse, market, and temple. Every voice has its hour. Every silence, its shape. From that day, the drum was not struck daily. Only when needed. Sometimes it would wait a week. Once, a month. And yet, when it rang, the city stopped. Because now, it meant something. In the far provinces, imitators began appearing. Small towns built their own drums, not to issue commands, but to mark moments of collective witness. One village rang theirs when a widow planted a grove on land once taken by a lord. Another sounded it when a girl born without speech painted a scroll that made elders weep. Wu never tried to control them. The echo was enough. The empire was learning that power didn't only flow from the throne. Sometimes, it rose from the spaces where no one had dared to speak. The mirror arrived in a box. No inscription. No emblem. No escort. Just wood and silence. It was left at the palace gates one misty morning, not by courier or servant, but by a stranger who vanished before the guards could ask his name. Wu had it carried inside. She expected bronze, perhaps silver. A message, maybe. A trick. But when she opened the lid, she found something stranger. There was no glass. Just a frame, carved from sandalwood, weathered by time, polished smooth by countless hands. Inside the frame was nothing but space. It should have been meaningless. But Wu stared at it for hours. A mirror without reflection. An object built to reveal, now reduced to invitation. Later, May arrived with scrolls, reports from the eastern ports, updates from the border schools, but Wu did not move. She merely gestured toward the frame. "What do you see?" May tilted her head. "Emptiness." Wu smiled faintly. "And yet, it draws the eye." That night, she ordered the frame to be placed in the Hall of Rites. Not on the wall, but standing upright in the center of the chamber, between incense burners and ceremonial drums. No explanation was given. No plaque was added. And still, they came. Ministers. Messengers. Kitchen hands. Street poets. Even skeptical generals. Each one stood before the frame. Some scoffed. Others lingered. Some whispered confessions into it, as if it might absorb them. One boy, a novice monk, simply bowed and wept. Within a week, the palace began to change. People lowered their voices in the corridors. Arguments paused when passing the mirror. Not from fear, from something else. From awareness. Wu visited it each morning. She stood before it without crown or attendants. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she looked tired. Once, she placed a single peach blossom at its base and whispered, "For every version of me I never became." She never explained the gesture. But rumors grew. They said the mirror was magic, that it could reveal past lives, or futures undone. Some believed it was the soul of the empire made visible. Others said it was a test, that the empress had placed it there to see who could bear to look at themselves without adornment. None of them were quite right. And none of them were wrong. In the provinces, copies began to appear. Artisans carved empty frames from driftwood, bone, or scrap metal. They hung them in courtyards, temples, stables. They called them listening frames. Some framed sky. Others reflected nothing but shadows. But always, they were honored. A potter in the mountains wrote. I looked at it for an hour. And remembered my mother's hands. A soldier wrote. It didn't speak. But I heard my childhood. The empire was remembering. Not its borders. Its shape. One evening, Wu stood before the frame as rain tapped the tiled roof above. She had aged. Her hands bore the maps of years, not in calluses, but in pauses. She no longer needed to speak every decree. The people had begun to write their own. But she still carried one fear. Not of revolt. Not of invasion. Of forgetting. That someday, the empire might forget why it had changed. That future rulers would inherit the tools without the reason. That someone might look into this empty mirror and see only themselves. So, she wrote one final letter. Not to her court. Not to her successors. To the mirror. You are not the answer. You are the question. Let those who stare see more than themselves. Let them see the hands that built the silence. The name spoken only once. The choices no scroll records. The voices that do not echo, but endure. She sealed the letter in wax, placed it behind the frame, and stepped away. She never looked into it again. Later, when scholars would write about her reign, they would argue over many things. Her policies. Her contradictions. Her faith. Her fears. But all agreed on one detail. In the Hall of Rites, long after Wu was gone, the frame remained. Still empty. Still waiting. Winter arrived not with snow, but with stillness. The winds in Luoyang no longer whispered, they paused, as if in respect. The market bells rang softer. Even the palace lanterns burned with a gentler flame, as though reluctant to outshine what was quietly fading. The Empress was dying. She did not announce it. She did not retreat behind curtains of gold or surround herself with physicians chanting spells. Instead, she let the days grow smaller, like brushstrokes fading toward the edge of a scroll. When asked how she felt, she replied only, like a river remembering the mountain. In her final days, she refused ceremony. No silk pillows. No jade charms. No ancestral rites. She ate simply, rice with pickled plum, warm broth in earthenware bowls. She asked for no music. Only silence, and the sound of wind through bamboo. May sat with her one afternoon, ink stains still on her sleeves. "Shall I record your last decree?" she asked. Wu shook her head. "Not yet. The empire must learn to write one without me." She gazed at the window, at the garden stones turning pale with frost. "I was never the beginning," she murmured. "Only the pause before one." The ghost court kept vigil, but did not intrude. Messages from governors and envoys piled like fallen leaves, unopened, unanswered. The people of the capital did not cry out or panic. Instead, they gathered in doorways, markets, and tea-houses, sharing memories like prayer. "She once changed my name. She listened when no one else would. She taught me that silence doesn't mean surrender." In a mountain monastery, a scroll was pinned to the door. She ruled not as flame, but as ash that warmed the coldest rooms. On her last morning, Wu asked to go outside. The attendants hesitated, the air was bitter, the ground hard with frost. But she insisted. Wrapped in a plain indigo robe, she was carried not to the throne room, nor the ancestral altar, but to the garden. There, amid bare plum branches and sleeping chrysanthemums, stood the throne. She had ordered it placed there the night before. It was not ornate, just wood, worn and smooth, no cushion, no carving. She stood beside it for a long time, not sitting, not speaking. The air held its breath. Then, finally, she spoke. "Power is not the seat. It is what you carry away from it." when you choose not to sit. She looked to the sky, pale, cloudless, indifferent. And she whispered, not to gods, not to courtiers, but to memory. I sat so others wouldn't have to ask permission. She died with eyes open. Not in fear. In attention. The next days were quiet. The bells did not toll. There was no great procession. No mourning garb ordered. The ghost court followed her last written instruction. Let the throne remain untouched. So it stood, in the garden, beneath the bare trees. No guards. No barrier. Anyone could approach. And they did. Not nobles. Not generals. Children. Storytellers. Wives of fishermen. Retired scribes. Wandering musicians. Some brought stones and left them at the base, each one carved with a word they were once afraid to say. Others brought names, of lost daughters, erased mothers, forgotten teachers. One old man, bent with age, leaned on the armrest and muttered, I hated you once. Then I learned to read. And I hated you less. The empire held its breath. No one seized power. No one declared themselves heir. And then, one dusk, 40 days after her death, a girl no older than 12 walked through the garden gate. She wore patched shoes and a robe 2 sizes too large. She walked past scholars and nobles without looking up. She stopped before the throne. And said, I don't want to sit. I just want to know why she did. The court, watching from the colonnades, did not speak. But someone wrote it down. And the words traveled farther than any edict ever had. The throne was never claimed. No coronation followed. A new generation rose, one raised not on fear, but on questioning. They learned history from storytellers, not scrolls. They debated in taverns, not just temples. They wrote poems to laws, and laws to poems. And though names changed and dynasties rose, one thing remained. A garden in Luoyang. With a single chair. Where no one dares to sit. Without remembering who once left it behind. In time, they forgot the exact shape of her face. They mispronounced her name. But they remembered how she ruled. By listening. By disappearing just enough to make others visible. And in every province, on the day of her passing, children gathered before a blank frame, one just like the mirror she left behind. And they were asked not to recite her deeds, but to answer a single question. What truth did she make you brave enough to say? And every year, the answers grew louder.